Right. I'm very foreign to this platform, and for the purpose of this talk, I have installed on both my computer teams, and also that the Andrew and Derek has been very helpful to do the trial. We have been trying many times. We try to foresee different kind of problems, but their problems are always unexpected. So it turns out that both my computer, each of them has some problems that just wouldn't host as I wanted to be. But I'm very lucky enough to have a friend who he has some hotspot that I can use the internet, so making one of the computer working, and then I can see you through internet. So I wanted to start to share my PPT here, and let me know if you can see it, and I will formally start the talk.
Yes, we can see the PPT. Thank you.
Right. Hello, everyone. Thanks for coming to my talk, and also many thanks to Derek and Andrew's efforts in organizing and hosting and all those meaningful exchange that leads to today's presentation in public. In fact, me and Derek have been talking about it for 2 years. That was before the pandemic. And also me and Andrew have go over the structure of talk and how to contextualize. So it's a joint effort that today's talk had been presented in front of you. As Derek already mentioned, my standard bio, which doesn't give more information now, and today, as indicated in the title, I'm going to talk about Writing Mother as a project. So Writing Mother is a complex program, and it has many participants, different roles, and different and a shift between sometimes you're contributors and reader, and sometimes you are more of editor, and it has different phrases, and it took on different forms, and it's almost 5 years old. So it's very hard to summarize all those activities and intentions in 45 minutes. That's how I aim to finish everything. And so I tried to make it simple and without losing its complexity for people who it's first time to know about the project. So the first thing you might want to know is among various programming and forms of engagement, Writing Mother has developed one output that remains steadily visible, and that is what I'm going to focus today. And that is the publishing of one episode or one book per year. So we simplify it to understand this is it's a book publishing project, but it's not that simple, but it's easier to understand in that way. So we have 3 books that have been designed and published in series, and we still have 2 that's coming at the end of this year, because there's a jet lag between when the content is made and the publishing is made. That's why we have 5 books, but in fact we already have 3 books that been published to the public, so the public can host the paper book. And before I go into details and the structure of today's talk, I wanted to talk about a couple of things that's very important to our project, but today we won't have time to cover. The first one is Writing Mother's workshop and the exhibition and visual programs that it has been involved in, and because it started as a artist project. So I just give you a quick photo, so you have impression of the scale and the sensitivity of it, and also the subject and how we done things. So that will be the only time we're going to show you exhibition visuals in this talk. And the second thing I will not have time to cover, and it's very important, is the role of our publisher, 51%. So the process of publishing is not as simple as I gave you the book and then you decide how to publish and we made a prize and distribute it. It's way more complicated than that because it's underground publishing and other issues. But today we won't have time to cover that. Another three things that's also very important that I will not have time to focus is the working ethic, also very important and lots of people are curious about. And I'm not assuming, or I cannot pretend that it's smooth and it has lots of back and forth and conflict, and it's not, usually it's not really a happy ending conversation. And second thing is Writing Mother had been invited to Taiwan to do, because both we use Mandarin or whatever you want to put it. I had to do 3 months residency in Taiwan, and we made some workshop there. But because of course limitation of time, and also Taiwan's a very different subject, I won't talk about it today. And the last thing I won't mention is my practice as whole. Of course, if you have an idea of that, it will be easier to understand Writing Mother as a separate project. So let's move on to what we're going to talk about today. The structure of talk will be, first I will introduce each episode, there are 5 of them, and I will discuss the motivation at the time and the context. Then second, I will talk about delivery, how it was delivered and how it was received. And then I will talk about some outlook of the project. And lastly, I'll talk about the discovery. What does this tell us about the current Chinese society? The last, the discovery part, I'm going to be just giving my guest. So I'm not theorist, and I'm not a I'm not in social science. I cannot give very accurate data, but through the accumulation, I have sense of how things go. And I hope if you're academics, you allowed me to be a little bit subjective and not very strictly structure any academic rules. Firstly, I wanted to explain a little bit the name of our subject, Writing Mothers. Its Chinese name is 写母亲. Maybe it will give you some misleading understanding of like this is about mother, or a mother writing about themselves or writing about other mothers. But in fact, we use this name as a way to find the things that everybody shared. And also we need to have a very safe and very low-key name. And we want to include as many as possible, and we want people to get interested in it. So in practice, we never make writing motherhood or mother mandatory. In the broadest sense, we see writing about mother as a way to write about the source and the cause, and in an abstract way, or in a very concrete way, in a private way, or in a public way. So as I promised in my structure, I'm going to talk about each episode. This is the first episode. When we started it, we don't have a name. It's just called 写母亲第一季. But when we reach a point at publishing it, we started to decide to give it a name. And these are some facts of this episode. And because it's the first one, I wanted to introduce a little bit of how it started. So the first episode, what we gather are close friends. Like we really know each other, and we have lots of things in common. And we are either art practitioners or cultural workers. And most of us has experience of living abroad and participating in non-state bounded cultural production, which I'll translate into Chinese is 体制外文化生产. And we found we cannot explain what we are doing to our parents. Not only we cannot explain, but also we might encounter very strong opposition from our parents. So the question comes, the tool we had gained throughout all those years, traveling, studying, talking, are they enough to explain or to deal with our personal relationship with our own parents? Can we make impact on our own mother's life? Or are we, from the very basic sense, able to understand our own upbringing and foster our own independency? So this is internal quest that we have. And then the social background at the time, which is 2017, is at least in China, um, uh, the public discourse has been trying to avoid talking about feminism. The simplest way to understand our project is we produce books, and the publication, it's a little bit delayed than our real content was formed. And next one, I'm talking about the important things that I will not cover. That will be quickly, we can go over those images. That will be the workshop that we used to run. And so we can go through this very quickly. There are like 7 of them. Yeah, these are exhibitions and workshop and participant programs that Writing Mother as a project have initiated and organized. And these will be the last exhibitional image you will see. The rest will be text. And then that's when I explain I will not have that our publisher is very important for us, but we won't have time to elaborate on the relationship and their role. And next slide, the things I keep saying that I followed the list of that we won't have time to cover. And next slide is the structure of today's talk. 1, 2, 3, pretty clear, I hope. And the next one is why we name ourselves Writing Mother, and how that doesn't mean that we only write about mother or only the contributors are only mother. We don't limit it ourselves to motherhood or the role, the identity of mother. We use it as the source and the cause we can examine. And after that, so we come to the first episode, and this gives you a very basic idea about how many words, how many characters, who are they, and its format. You can find it in the Google Drive I share as well. And next slide will be the place that we stopped. Next one. Yeah, that's the place I was at. Go back. Okay, yes, that's the place I stopped. So I was talking about within China, it was hard to talk about feminism in many ways, and then so I felt personal experience could be a good place to start and to reach out for further debate. So after we have finished this episode, after we produce the text, what we find out as a discovery is this. So, because I wanted to give you a little bit summary of this episode, what it's about. So we soon find the difficulties are shared. Even if we are capable to distinguish the status layer of the narrative surrounding us, and make sure we differentiate ourselves from there. We cannot cut off our tie to our mother as a person. And this particular person, our mother, may already become the embodiment of those state-run narrative. She can be the victim as well as the criminal at the same time. So this episode ends with the sentence that you can read from the slide. Perhaps this is where we can start our work by embracing the figures of mothers who are unafraid of exile, and we are allowing ourselves to become children who are unafraid to abandon the existing symbolic significance of the mother. So this gives you a sense of the first episode, and let's move to the next slide. That I will talk about the second episode. So the second one follows what it was left from the first one, but we opened it more and bring it further. By that I mean we started to have observers in the WeChat group, because that's where we do discussion, and we also invite strangers, not only friends. So that kind of opens up the experience. And our output has, so the format of this episode is we have letters, 来信, we have the first letter, second letter, and then we discuss about things we want to talk about around the letter. And so in that way, each letter has space for individual to talk about their stories in a very uninterrupted way. In this episode, we insinuate one particular sentiment and its medium. It's called 抒情体. That's why we have the title called 抒情体. Next slide. So, Derek, do you mind to read this text, that how we define 抒情体 and how we find how it was operating in our emotional structure of our life?
Yes, I'd be happy to do so. This tradition of emotional outpouring, 抒情体, has been established as one of the most mainstream genres since the founding of the PRC, I think. From red songs and poems that praise this new China to novels and Chinese textbooks. When the critical dimension is taken away, what is left of realism is just a performance, which are realist in name, are actually emotive outpourings, and in the worst cases, they are ideologically oriented. Premier Joe's Pajamas, which I read in second grade, I think, is a typical example, a conventional narrative on the surface, but filled with artificial sentimentality. First, it twists Deng Yingqiao into a Madonna figure. The image of the revolutionary is totally suppressed. And then it celebrates this unassuming and caring form of dedication. Ideology, as we know, often disguises itself as aesthetics and insinuates itself into the emotional structures of people. And that's from Chen Ting.
Much. That's very nice. Feels like in the Shakespeare show or something. And so that gives you an idea of what we are dealing with, and the second episode, of course, it's filled with lots of details and stories. It's not always highly theorized words, and so overall, in the first two episodes, we share our observation on the ways policy had shaped the life of our own mother, and how mainstream discourse depict and discussed mothers, and how the very concept of motherhood has been hijacked at various points in history. But when the project achieved that, like we already discussed symbolically what it is and what medium it was used, and I'm thinking of something else. That is, how about those who don't usually write? How can our project engage them? So then it comes to the third episode. That will be next slide. So the third episode, it's a transitional one. I'm waiting for the slide. No, yeah, yes, you're right. It's called Yao Yao's 来信, Yao Yao's letter. I co-organized this this episode with the curator Wang Yaming, and we wonder some questions such as, if the language we use to discuss art is vastly different than the language of getting by in daily life, how are we to understand the potential and the impossible of each form? And when people who write professionally and the people who write for pleasure or for escape come together, what kind of design is needed to build a meaningful exchange and a thoughtful balance and the power of speech? So then that was what bear in mind. Of course, reality is always more complex and surpass our imagination in a way. So we have experienced lots of moment of people quitting the program, or one doesn't understand each other, and people accusing of disrespect traditional value. In Chinese, 我们是不孝顺的孩子. But regardless, the third episode take its form. So the final form is like this. We select a letter from a public servant. Her name here is Yao Yao. And then her letter kind of described her daily life, and then ended with, the gulf between occupation is like the gulf between mountains. 隔行如隔山. I can't imagine how an artist or freelancer organized a day's work. So after she wrote about herself, she wanted to know the rest of people who she assumed are artists or freelancers, how their days are like. So we picked this letter as a beginning point and organized 32 people to respond to the letter. And their roles and their age are indicated in the slide. But these are just give you an idea. So what appears frequently in the third episode is the word 体制. Although this particular word does not appear in Yao Yao's original letter. And among the 22 replies we received and she received, 12 include the word multiple times. So then next slide, we of course, because this is the language coming out from conflict or come from when we are exchanging. So our translator, Stefan, and he wrote about what is 体制, because that's not a word I can simply translate. And that's why I put this slide here. And this concept become, or this problem become obvious to us when the language become obvious to us. And so this episode eventually become a place for a world that breaks two pillars of our society. On the one hand, you have 体制内公务员, public servant. On the other hand, you have freelancer artists at the other end. And both sides are not as what the other have imagined them to be. So it's kind of like we use detail and then reaction to break the stereotype. But then there are things that are not communicatable. So this third episode was a writing and discussion process that neither assume or grow from, and of course didn't aim for consensus. And what I can do at a certain point, I realize, is to draw attention to the content and the factors informing who cannot reach what kind of consensus and why. And remember this, I'm talking about consensus because I will come back to that at the very end of the talk. And next slide. Next slide is our fourth episode. We're still working on the final text, even though we have all the draft. This called So the Educator. It starts from the confusion and the frustration of a high school Chinese teacher, 语文老师, from a small county in northern part of China, and expand into different issues that lie in different forms of education in our world today, including overseas education and difference between America and Europe, and alternative education and early child education and all of that. We discussed the hierarchy of the education and education as a means of gaining class mobility. Then that's the fourth episode, and now we arrive at the fifth episode, which are the most recent. This episode, as you can tell from the name, reflects its time more than any other episode before because it deals with the ongoing pandemic. And this episode also different than other episode in another way in terms of a social group, because it's a collection of essays that center around one particular social group, that is the drifting migrant female worker, in Chinese, 流动女工. And I will go because it's very recent, and it's in fact the thickest book we ever made. I'm going to elaborate a little bit into the book. So maybe we can switch to next slide. Okay. So this is the index of the book. Just give you some facts. So it's around 100,000 Chinese character, and it includes 7 essays from 4 different drifting migrant female workers, and other 4 essays from specific respondents of different social status. The book also includes 10 visual illustrations, all of which come from the migrant workers themselves, and they were recently introduced to the medium. And the word pandemic, it's a word coined from kinship and pandemic, and it's an episode that involves tutor and student relationship that wasn't existed in the previous episode. So next slide. I will just give you very small example of how I framed their writings, because they are already narrative around migrant workers or female migrant workers, and I wanted to show how I construct the book a little bit different than most of NGO logic. The first chapter is called Yang Mo and her son. So Yang Mo wrote, as you can tell from the slide, she was laid out workers from textile industry and become domestic workers drifting in Beijing. In her first essay, My Terrible Life, she wrote from early childhood to until now, and how miserable everything has been, including her parents' marriage, her own marriage, her workers and financial, her working situations and financial situations, and all of everything. And so we would imagine this will be quite touching and evoke empathy, of course, empathy from many readers, and especially from her son. But then in her son's response to her essay, My Terrible Life, he gave a very different perspective. And so that's why you need to read our book, is why he cannot so always identify with the tragedies and the cause of those tragedies his mom had already subscribed to. So here it really complex the narrative of one person talking about miserable life, and that miserable life somehow deserve our intention. So things are more complicated than that. But that does not say that I don't find her story touching and meaningful and explain what had been happened over in the China over 50 years. So next slide. Next slide. The author, her name is Meng Yu, Dreamy Rain, if we translate it. She is also at her 50s and work as domestic workers in Beijing. And she came out from rural China after her husband had injured from a car accident. She has been engaged with many different NGO and even make appearance on television. She would not consider as very common domestic workers. And the drawing you saw here is her own drawing. I have been her tutor of drawing for a while. This chapter are constructed by the first essay, My Mother, who she described her mother who is at her 80s with all respect and love and admiration. And so her mother is a typical kind of rural China woman that doesn't read and doesn't write, but with a very kind heart and went through all difficulties. So it's very standard, even a CCTV scenario in a way. But in the second essay, she wrote a letter to her daughter, who was about to give a birth, but at a very young age. And in this letter, she kind of giving her advice as someone who experienced lots of urban culture and also open-minded information from the NGO, for example, feminism and or not conventional way of just married and gave birth. Because her daughter believed in the value, like she just believed as a woman you need to marry and you have to have a kid. And she also find her brothers who are older brothers who have not married unacceptable. So she find that shame. It's a shame that they have not been married and produced no kids. And she even say that there's no there's no point of receiving higher education. You don't make more money, and you don't even have a wife. So education means nothing. So Meng Yu wrote a letter to her daughter to say, well, the world may not be the way you think. And so we see a conflict here of an older generation supposedly to be more traditional because her access to the city become more enlightened or liberating, and then come back to tell some new idea to the daughter who live in the rural China, and where you have a mobile phone, have internet, but this young generation's mindset might not be more open than the old generation. So that's the complexity. And then the third essay, a letter to Miaozi. I want to introduce a little bit of Miaozi. Yes, that's right. The slide were right. So Miaozi, she's kind of my friend. She graduated from Academy of Art in Guangzhou, trained as a fashion designer, but she chose a very freelance or independent life of open a Taobao store or have some alternative artist practice. She was pregnant, but then her relationship wasn't satisfying, and the father of the kids decided to disappear, and so everything was not favorable on her side, but she decided to keep the baby. But not as a random or impulsive or willful decision, but also a very purposeful challenge to the existing system. She believed in we can have a team of friends that to raise these kids together. It's not only mother's responsibility of parenting. And she read extensively about how different format of family that can be. Of course, if you are a single mother in China, and there are abundance of problems that come after this child was born, but she was determined, and she also has artist friend to help her. So then you see Meng Yu as someone at the fringe of the society because of financial and educational background. And then you also see Miaozi in the fringe of society because of her choice, even though she was very well educated. So I introduced Miaozi's story to Meng Yu because she had done interview and she also made art about her life. And Meng Yu, after read all those material, decided to write Miaozi a letter. So in that letter, in short, she supports Miaozi as a woman that doesn't want or would not ended up with marriage, but she is very much against the idea of raising a kid by herself because she thought, of course, that's dangerous, and she was assumed no one will want to dedicate it to that mission in the long-term base if it's not the mother. And she also proposed, she said, if you love kids and the financial difficulties, you can be a domestic worker. And that way you can make money by taking care of other people's kids. So this, the story, of course, ends with their dialogue. We don't have further more possibility of make them more engaged, except I send in each other something. And this is the drawing Meng Yu made about Miaozi, partly through her imagination, partly through the photo I gave her. Next slide. This chapter 3 focuses on one character. Her name is Yanzi. She was born in rural Guangxi. Its very long essay was 50 1 its original I think we just had a power down. Is everything okay? Can people hear me?
Yes, we can hear you again, Jing. Yeah.
In the village, because I'm in the village, the power was down for 1 second, and then everything came back. So in her essay, she described in every detail all the difficulties she encountered from the as a very young child to current situation to now, and was very difficult in many sense, and the trouble comes one after the other. And from her essay, one can tell like why their life had been made so hard and why they won't have any other options in alternative. But Yanzi is a person that I made her life, and also her sister who made the drawings here. That's her younger sister. Made their life very different by making the book. Her younger sister was able to register in the alternative school that my friend run, and will help her to find some scholarship, so she can went through a very different track. Next slide. I don't have more translation here because we're still waiting for a translator to translate text. This fourth chapter focuses on patient Hong Li. So to make it the long story short, she was diagnosed breast cancer during the pandemic. The drawing on the left is how she shifted from different hospital and different it goes through different process. The difficulty was very obvious. It's very obvious. It's like as a rural person with very little health care and health insurance, it was very hard for her to register into hospital to receive proper care and proper treatment, and also the corruption within the hospital system make lots of things untransparent and maybe to her view over treated, like they made her buy things more than she needed. And she wrote with a certain sarcasm that was not so obvious in other writers' essay. And the last chapter. Our last chapter was written by non-migrant worker. She is a social worker who was dedicated to help migrant worker in case of the lawsuit and writing or different kinds of issues. But then this essay is about how she questioned this process of regular NGO belief of like you provide help and then can help, then things will be improved. She more focused on that. She realized if you don't have imagination of your life, even the material sense was improved, that you will never really be able to change your own life. So there's one kind of idea that was very precious from her essay is that is different than most of the people I met is you don't build your imagination or your spiritual life, we call it 精神世界, or after you reach certain material stability. Because most of Chinese, no matter where their background are, believe this 唯物主义 that you have to build material life first, and everything like art or expression that comes after you have a stable life. So she made her argument as a practitioner, and she's organizing a band now that sing songs for the workers or from the workers. So next slide. So as a small summary, I wanted to just distinguish our project a little bit from many like nonfiction writing or oral stories collection. There's one particular things that I very much value is I encourage a process of making problems more relevant and more relatable by describing them together. So in a way, we don't accept just submission. You have to be there to discuss with other people, and also we don't judge the experience itself. For example, we have Meng Yu's mother who support the family plan 计划生育, because without 计划生育, she will be a baby production machine. But then for lots of people who from urban background, of course, family plan has been so too violent and too inhuman. So, but we, as a project, we welcome this truthful description of person's life. But then beyond that, we also challenge the narrative. For example, through the process, I need people to explain why you do that, and have you thought through it, and have you can you see alternative after you write about this experience. So that create also a very different reader and writer relationships, because some of our readers would become the writer, and writer also read other people's writing. So there's the boundary between reading and write not as passive as just publication and then readers. Next slide. And so also our translator, also reviewer of our project, described a little bit what the text reads like, because I guess most of you have never read our books, so it will be helpful to for you these summaries. So in a way, I think it was true that the project itself is fundamentally contrived, and none of these letters would exist, could exist were their author not invited to participate. And next slide. And so I moved to this very important section of delivery and reception, because I think you already had that question in mind. We have facing two very important paradoxes, and we deal with that almost every day. And one is if we go through the standard publication system, that we need to obtain boot code, and that will be lots of money, and also censorship. And if we went through that, but then that would give us biggest or the most desirable or most appropriate readership, and that will maximize our influence. And because when you do some project, you want people to be able to read it, but then as a reality, this is not possible. So when we weight or balance that with the sustainability, which is like I be able to continue to do the project, and then I have bigger space of our production, like my publisher never really change. Like we won't make change because of she disagree or anything. So. And so for this particular paradox, I already gave my answer. So I choose sustainability over and bigger space or freedom over a real potential big influence or readership. So if we talk about readership, then we cannot really talk about readership as in a normal sense. And the second paradox is, on the one way, as one can tell, I or people that work with me, we wanted to get closer to the mass or 群众, however you call it. But then, as a reality, not every when you're dealing with the mass, you can't the criticality degree decreased. Even though I don't know if it's true that the mass always have less criticality, and who am I to say I have the best or highest criticality? But as reality, when we read the text, we know those with the that we like multiple perspective and with more complexity and with more openness and more reflection. So as someone who produced text, I always wanted to have more criticality in our project. So that's a paradox that I constantly have to face and have no obvious or immediate solution. Next slide. And so so just as I mentioned, I already decided we'll go through independent publishing, and we attend our book fair, and independent bookstore are our ways of distribute. To give you a number, when we first published first episode and second episode, we published 200 copies for each, and that takes 2 to 3 years to sell all of them. to run out. So within 2 to 3 years, we sold 200 copies. But and then for the 5th episode, we print 800 copies so far, and we are doing okay. And maybe next year we're going to reprint more. But that is already a very good record. So that's the first thing I've decided. Another thing is I wanted to be able to maintain, and we have already been running without any funding. we sometimes get some money to do specific thing when I was invited to do an exhibition, but that's the budget for that, putting up the exhibition. I was able to manage to translate the first and the second episode and a little bit of the fifth episode, but those money coming from the exhibition invitations. And also our project wanted to promise free PDF. Now, because the nature of the project was to bring in, to bridge people. If you want to buy a book, you need to pay for the book. But as for my intention, I don't want, I want people to be able to obtain free PDF. But that was kind of my decision at this moment. I don't know how it will be changed later. Next slide. So at this moment, what I'm busy with for this project are the following things, and these are things I'm looking forward to make it happen. And we have already talked to independent publishing place in Taiwan. So it's very possible we publish all of them in Taiwan and we'll have different readership and feedback, and something will grow from there. But also the copy will be very small amount too. And then of course I have some like publishing house from different art organization, and they might wanted to publish their version. For example, a friend in Thailand that we're talking about that possibilities. And the second thing I very much wanted to happen, and I also hope that's something you guys can help me with, is I have hope or the wishes to publish our text or our books in the English-speaking world, and this funky. Sorry, because I have a phone ring in front of me. We already had some text been properly translated. We wanted to find a suitable, appropriate, and very active publisher to introduce our idea and our content to the English-speaking world. I think this would take time, and also it's not a text that fit into existing categories. But I guess it will be helpful given the current circumstance about the disconnection between China and the rest of the world, and also the disconnection about how common Chinese people think and why they think in that way, and the antagonism between each side. And third thing that is also happening now, and I think it's very positive, I received invitation to give writing class under the sometimes NGO setting, or it's through foundation or some alternative private school. Well, sorry, wait a second, because I'm using a 热点, and there's a phone, because it's not my phone, I have to answer. 你等一下啦，我现在有事，我不能接电话，我现在放在我身边，你跟老师说好吗？ Sorry, it's a bit chaotic. In those writing class, I will be able to use the text as kind of textbook and to engage my students, to provoke them, and the student will becoming maybe our future contributors. But of course, this have to operate in a very small and private and sort of low-key way. And next slide. So we are reaching at the end. I hope it wasn't too long. So as a summary and as a tentative way of thinking, and in retrospective, I classify all our participants into three categories. And these three categories also are very distinctive for me in real life. And I have drawn some observation on them. So the first one, mostly Tijune middle class, the system-bound middle class. And the second one maybe would include myself and some of my friend who share my value are the educated, but outside the traditional confine of society. And we largely share post-materialistic desire for ideological independence, both for ourselves, or themselves, or the others. And the third category are those I've been in contact a lot recently, and in the past 2 years at least, are the drifters or the 底层群众 or 底层 are living at the fringe of the society with the little access to equal educational, welfare, and other resources. I spelled, there was a typo there. And these authors are less concerned with the freedom than sustainability and being able to meet their material needs, which are surprisingly, their desire was surprisingly similar to the perspective of the most system-bound middle-class contributors. So I don't know whether this feed into lots of other people's research or your recent impression, but that's somehow my impression from the project. So next slide. So the context has been changed since 2017. And we had the hope of that we try to understand why we don't have consensus, and we try to live without consensus, and we try to bridge different people, but things are becoming very difficult and very complex due to the post-truth situation. And when I searched post-truth, I saw that Oxford Dictionary had made it into the word of 2016. But for China, I guess for UK, that's pretty much related to the Brexit and all of that. But for China, we have a different storyline and different scenario, because we were somehow a place that lots of news and information has been manipulated anyways. But then this is new, and that how China being part of this post-truth reality, also it's new to me, and that was been intensified by what happened in Hong Kong and also the pandemic. Because after the pandemic, most of Chinese people believe China is doing much better than the rest of the world, and they are very proud of that, and they were very much willing to pay the price. And so then this bridge or this criticality mission that we have in our project become even more difficult to reach, because before this process of certain knowledge and truth can be identified, can be debated on. And now it's very, like, to identify truth or to prove truth is becoming more difficult, impossible, and unwanted. So that's kind of my ending note. Then I have 2 more slides. Next one. But ultimately, the spirit of the project is to ask to what extent our linguistic choice are truly conscious choice, and what exactly is the nature of the relationship between them and our fate. We have different answers, and we have different agencies, and the future is a little bit unknown for me, even though we're working on the next episode, and I definitely see we're very motivated to continue the project. So that brings me to the end. So the next slide. I very much welcome your thoughts, and also maybe any ideas you have of how to make this project as a publishing project better known in the English-speaking world, and also maybe the idea of teaching using it as a text, and or to any other kinds of collaboration will be very welcome. And thank you for inviting me again, and thanks for being here to listen to the talk. Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed, Jing. That was an incredibly rich and interesting talk, and you're doing very innovative and unique work, clearly. So thank you for sharing that with us and overcoming all technical difficulties, even a power cut and incoming phone calls and on the phone you've borrowed to help us provide this talk today. So we've had some questions coming in the chat. Andrew asks, could you talk more about your background with migrant workers? How did you come to be collaborating routinely with people from very different backgrounds? And also, how did the pandemic typically affect migrants in China? Did most go home despite restrictions on movement, or did they stick around in the cities and get by somehow?
There's lots of questions.
Yes. I think it's focusing on the migrant workers. How did you get to know them, and what did they do during the pandemic?
That's true. In fact, we are slightly more visible after the 5th episode, because the migrant workers